Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is the burning alive of the Jordanian pilot by ISIS. There are some essential issues that need to be uncovered and discussed that will allow a deeper and better understanding of ISIS, what it is, what it believes, and what it holds dear. The Jordanian pilot that was burned to death by ISIS forces, named Mu'adh al-Kasebe, was a Muslim. His crime was that he was doing the bidding of the heretic, of the invader, of the West, of the United States. He was flying and attacking ISIS targets as part of the Jordanian contribution to the US-led coalition against ISIS. Despite petitions extended on his behalf, invoking his Islamic tradition and the Islamic tradition in general, and the requirement not to do harm to another Muslim, ISIS was bent on publicly executing al-Kasebe. And so they did. The reasons should, by the way, and by now be obvious to everyone. This Jordanian pilot, downed in December, was worse than a non-believer, worse than a heretic. Al-Kasebe was a traitor who betrayed ISIS's conception of Islam. And so, he was brutally murdered, mutilated, placed in a black cage, and burned to death, while the camera was rolling, and then covered and buried with dry sand. The video spread like wildfire on the social networks. It actually has a title. The title of the video by ISIS was, quote, "Healing the Believers' Chests." It is taken from the Quran, Surah 9, verse 14. A better translator would have probably translated it this way: healing the breast of the believers. Here's how the quote actually goes: "Fight them, and Allah will punish them by your hands. Cover them with shame. Help you over them, and heal the breasts of believers." That's the whole quote. That's the exact quote from the Quran itself. The executions like this in Islam are very unusual. There are executions in the judicial process, and capital crimes exist in Islam, and they decapitate, as we know. Beheadings are the most common form of punishment meted out that we saw in terms of capital punishment. But there are other forms of execution in Islam. In general, burning someone alive is reserved for a Muslim who betrayed Islam, like one who converted to Christianity. The fear factor is also a very important part of this style of Islamic execution. And ISIS is bringing that fear factor to whole new heights. Beheading, carried out by, let's say, and videotaped by and disseminated throughout the internet by ISIS, has sent a message across the world. It is a message of fear and horror. Onlookers, especially Muslims, were mortified by this open display of barbarity. And everyone, including Muslims, became fearful of this force that was executing so many people, mostly Muslims, but even Westerners. Horrifying as it is to us, this move to burn the Jordanian pilot is even more of a message than the decapitations are. And it is more of a message to the Muslim masses than it is to the Western world. The message is clear. ISIS sees you as traitors and collaborators. ISIS sees you as having abandoned the true path. For ISIS, the viciousness and barbarity, to quote President Obama, of the burning has a dual purpose. Not only was it meant to intimidate anyone who stands in the way of their message and mission, it is a recruiting tool. I repeat that. This kind of video is a recruiting tool. Burning the pilot alive was a recruiting tool. The burning and beheading are meant to help recruit new members. They are means through which ISIS is able to return honor and tradition to the ISIS brand of Islam. And they are being used to draw people into their flock and to challenge modern ideas of equality and freedom. ISIS hopes to not only mesmerize young people to join their cause, but also to persuade them to support ISIS in a word and deed that is very, very important on their home turfs. They are recruiting disenfranchised youth to fight alongside ISIS, not only in the Middle East, but in Europe and America and around the globe. Most importantly, ISIS is making a play for the middle of the Islamic world. They are sending out the message that if you are not going to fight with us or support us, then be silent about us. Because if you are not, we can and we will execute you. Well, before the deadline for negotiations had even passed, before their pilot was even executed by ISIS, the Jordanians responded to ISIS. ISIS said that they will execute the downed Jordanian pilot they captured and were holding unless Jordan releases a female terrorist. Jordan decided to up the ante. They countered the threatened ISIS. The Jordanians said, "Give us proof that our pilot is alive. If you kill our pilot," the Jordanians said, "we will execute all ISIS prisoners in Jordan." This was not meant as an idle threat. Jordan is not a foreigner to the threat of force and the use of violence. That threat by Jordan may explain why, even though the deadline for the prisoner exchange was on Thursday of that week, ISIS waited until next Tuesday to carry out the murder. I expect a slew of brutal executions of ISIS members at the hands of Jordan will continue now after the pilot has been so brutally burned and murdered. I also expect that these too will be broadcast. There is a method to all of ISIS's madness. We need to understand it in order to fight it. This is not simply what the president called viciousness and brutality, unquote. It's about power and the challenge to that power. Jordan is demonstrating great anger and fury in their fight against ISIS, so much so that the Jordanians are decorating their bombs with verses from the Quran condemning ISIS. On their return flight from a bombing raid that targeted ISIS, fighter jets did an honorary pass over the hometown of their fallen pilot in arms. And while it's not being spoken about, I'm certain that Jordan has begun special ground ops raids into Iraq to get better intelligence about ISIS and even attack ISIS encampments. The King of Jordan rushed back from the United States, where he'd been visiting, to take his place at the helm of his country in this time of crisis. He has announced that Jordan will double down in their fight against ISIS. Not all of Jordan agrees with the king and with the anger aimed at ISIS, and this is important. There is a part of Jordan that is in agreement with ISIS, with their beliefs and their tactics. And it's important to know that they are, and what they are saying. Be prepared to see real divisiveness in Jordan, and by extension in the rest of the Arab world. After the video of the burned and mutilated Jordanian pilot went viral, many Jordanians took to social media with the hashtag that quickly became popular and reads, "Not our war" and "Not our pilot." A large group of Jordanians are not empathizing with the pilot and his family or his mission, but they are empathizing with the brutal murderers, the ISIS terrorists. The pilot came from a tribe that was extremely loyal to the King of Jordan, and that tends to be the division. Tribes that are loyal tend to be loyal to the king, while Palestinians, who compose about 60% of Jordan, tend to be less loyal and consequently less trusted by the king. The potential for internal conflict in Jordan is huge, and ISIS knows it. So does the king. Jordan has turned into a potential future battleground for ISIS. A religious leader in ISIS who voiced his objections to what's going on and the burning of the Jordanian pilot has been removed from his official position. He will stand trial and he himself may be executed. At a meeting of religious leadership of ISIS that was held in Al-Bab in the province of Aleppo, the imam stood up and said that the burning of the Jordanian pilot was a violation of Islamic law. Many Islamic scholars, even some who support Al-Qaeda and are advisors to them and ISIS, have condemned the burning and the compilation and release of this video. The imam also said that those responsible for the burning should face trial themselves. Remember, these statements were not made as a public pronouncement, but rather during a discussion amongst religious leadership. It must be made clear to everyone, even ISIS, and that even religious leaders in ISIS are not able to be honestly and to express their feelings and thoughts. In ISIS, there is no room for discussion, even among those who we once thought were part of the inner circle. Coming up next, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. First up is a column from the great columnist from the New York Times, Thomas L. Friedman. Friedman is probably the most influential columnist writing in English, and maybe the most influential columnist in the world. You remember the Saudi peace plan I spoke about a few weeks ago? Well, that plan had its initiative with Tom Friedman. When he writes something, people pay attention, even if they disagree. I know that the White House totally disagrees with this Friedman essay. I chose this essay because I wanted to see how some of Obama's supporters, writers and pundits, and thinkers were approaching the White House's use of the term terrorist and Islamic terrorist. Were White House supporters in favor of parsing these terms? Friedman wrote this piece in the New York Times on January 21st, 2015. It's called Say It Like It Is. Now, before we start the Friedman, you should know something, that the columnist does not select or even have input in the title of the column. Titles come from the editors, in this case, editors of the editorial page. Friedman begins, I've never been a fan of global conferences to solve problems, but when I read that the Obama administration is organizing a summit on countering violent extremism for February 18th in response to the Paris killings, I had a visceral reaction. Is there a box on my tax returns that I can check so that my tax dollars won't go for this? This was an attempt at humor, a Friedman attempt at humor. It's pretty good. He has a very good sense of humor. He is a great storyteller. He continues his analysis in the piece. Quote, when you don't call things by their real name, you always get into trouble. And this administration, so fearful of being accused of Islamophobia, is refusing to make any link to radical Islam from the recent explosion of violence against civilians. Friedman then shouts, we have entered the theater of the absurd, unquote. Friedman now quotes Rich Lowry, which is a strange person from the quote. He's a conservative columnist and the editor of the National Review. Although this essay actually appeared in Politico, which is a whole different question. Friedman says that he could not believe the ridiculous quotes that Rich Lowry used when quoting White House spokesman Josh Earnest, until Friedman checked the transcript and the quotes were correct. The essay is excellent. He calls a spade a spade. Friedman wants to call terror terror, and he is right. I know the White House read this piece, but I also know that they strongly disagreed. Second up is a column from several months ago. I reread it recently and found that it was as important today as the day it was written. I realized that the news and the news concerning the show should be fresh, but this is the kind of program that deals with ideas. And those ideas are topical and often have an arc. And that arc is what makes the topics relevant today, yesterday, and tomorrow. And that means that very often we can swap one set of examples for another, but the topics and the themes are very similar. This column was published in the Miami Herald in September. It was actually syndicated, so it ran all around on the date of September 18th. The column is by Andrew J. Bacevich, and it's entitled, "Islamic State is a Symptom, Not a Disease." Bacevich is a professor at BU at Boston University and is the product of West Point. He has a master's and a PhD from Princeton. Bacevich was a vocal critic of Bush and the war in Iraq, calling it actually, quote, "a catastrophic failure," unquote. He tries to outline the biggest issues confronting ISIS right now, and he does a very, very good job of it. Bacevich begins, "Comprehensive strategy, that's the operative phrase that the Obama administration has employed in rolling out its new campaign to take on the Islamic State." Now Bacevich uses some tongue-in-cheek humor in order to move on. He says, "With its connotations of scope and gravity, the phrase resonates not unlike extra heavy duty or bigger and better than ever." Bacevich describes the policy so far as whack-a-mole. Whack-a-mole. It's a fascinating idea. It means wherever you see a mole, you take a mallet and you whack it. Not very effective, obviously. A real policy must be developed, he says. So Bacevich suggests that there are people that think that the best policy is just to bomb them all. Often people tell me, let's say for instance, the same thing. Their suggestion, and they say, just make a parking lot of the place. In other words, just destroy everything. Bacevich says here that this is simply not an answer, and even the strategists who suggest it admit that a military response is not a real solution to this. He suggests that you have to erect a real set of defenses and live up to your ideals. In other words, do what you say you're going to do. Bacevich concludes, quote, "A long-term proposition requiring considerable patience and not without risk, you bet. But the alternative is whack-a-mole from now until the cows come home. And that's no strategy. It's an admission of failure, accepting permanent war as inevitable." The entire thesis makes sense, but Bacevich too lacks any real substance. It's true that simply bombing them will not work, and whack-a-mole doesn't work either. But Bacevich does not really tell the White House how to compose a strategy, just suggests to compose one. I have some ideas myself, I must tell you. I'll expand on them in a future show. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. The first cartoon comes from the Daily Star in Beirut. The Daily Star is the largest English paper in Lebanon. They periodically run my column. The cartoonist of here is Jabra Stavro. He was born in 1947 in Beirut. His work is found in newspapers and websites all over the Mideast. This cartoon was published on February 11th, 2015. The cartoon is an image of the globe, the world in an ocean, and there's an octopus strangling the world. The head of the octopus is black and reads terrorism. Its tentacles read ISIS, Daesh, and al-Nusra. ISIS, of course, is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Daesh is the Arabic acronym for ISIS, and al-Nusra is the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. This cartoon is insightful. It's far more powerful because of the fact that we know that the artist is an Arab and the audience is the Arab world, specifically Beirut, Lebanon. The second cartoon is from the Orange County Register. It was published on February 5th, 2015. It's by a character named Cam, C-A-M. Cam is short for Cameron Cardo. This piece depicts the devil handing out report cards. The entire foreground and background is filled with fire. The devil says, report cards are in, and he's holding a huge A. And coming to get the report card is ISIS. This is very well done. From our point of view, it so appropriately describes and depicts the situation that ISIS and their deeds are the opposite of what we consider good. But the devil, of course, is giving them an A. The last cartoon is from Fatah's Information and Cultural Commission's website. It was brought to my attention by Palestinian Media Watch, PMW. The image is of the Temple Mount, with the two great mosques, that's in Jerusalem, and a swell of rats eating away at the foundation of the mosques, which is actually an apple core. The rats all have stars of David on them. The text reads, "Where is the Muslim Ummah?" Ummah in Arabic means nation. It's exactly the same word, by the way, as in Hebrew, Am. Am and Ummah is the same word, same meaning. This cartoon shows the point of view of the Palestinian Authority. What they think of Israel. It's truly, deeply problematic. The artist also depicts what he thinks of the Muslim world. This artist is suggesting that the Muslim world has totally abandoned the Palestinians. In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. I want to think out loud with you now. Everyone thinks that the Palestinians are rooting for Bibi to lose the upcoming Israeli elections. After all, it seems that the peace process has ground to a halt, and that the Palestinian leader Abbas and the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu are arch enemies. Conventional wisdom is that a prime minister from the labor camp, from the newly merged party called the Zionist camp, would be far more amenable to Abbas and Palestinians, their demands, than Likud is. The labor camp wants a resolution, more than Likud does, and will do more to get it. At least that's what the pundits are saying. But the truth, however, seems a little unclear. It seems unclear that the Palestinian Authority might want that resolution. And if they don't want that resolution, they may actually be rooting for Netanyahu to win. Why? Because Netanyahu is the perfect scapegoat. He's the perfect reason for not needing to move forward and to move towards a resolution. With Netanyahu in position as prime minister, the Palestinians can blame the lack of progress squarely on him. If part of the Palestinian goal really is to avoid the resolution, and I think it is, by the way, then it should be obvious that they will be extremely happy if Likud and Netanyahu trounce the newly merged middle-left party called the Zionist camp. But do not expect them to admit that publicly. Also, people quote polls as if they were quoting the gospel. They are not. Polls now being conducted in Israel prior to upcoming elections are a great example of this. The recent polls are showing now that Likud, the party of the prime minister, is gaining a little bit. Likud has moved into the top slot, which, with each week passing, their numbers have been increasing. And this increased fame and political fortune comes despite the fact that pundits, both in Israel and the United States, predicted that Bibi would take a huge hit because he accepted Boehner's invitation to address both houses of Congress. Actually, the opposite is true. Netanyahu is more popular, and his party continues to grow in popularity. One of the reasons for this and the rise of his popularity is that Israelis are enjoying seeing the prime minister standing up to Obama. If the White House wants to sabotage Bibi in the next election, they should probably be nice to him. That would send a very different message to Israel. That would paint Netanyahu with the same brush as a failed U.S. Middle East policy. And that would be the political kiss of death. Instead, Obama has breathed new life into his campaign. Netanyahu and his Likud party are flourishing. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, tell me what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that Arabic and Hebrew are sister languages? I mentioned earlier that the word for people is the same, Am in Hebrew, Ummah in Arabic. They are both Semitic languages. Those languages which write from right to left have three-letter roots. The word Semitic comes from one of the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Yefet. And according to tradition, Shem was the father of the societies that emerged in what is now the Middle East. So the founders of the science of language, philology, and etymology, which is the science of roots, categorized these languages into a group and gave them a name, Semitic. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.